Welcome to Cozy Sleep Haven. Wind down, cuddle up, and let's get cozy. Tonight's episode invites you to join Grace, the calming presence behind Havenport's treasured meditation studio, for a journey filled with warmth and creativity. We'll begin in Grace's peaceful studio, where the soft glow of candles dances against the walls and the subtle aroma of lavender lingers in the air. Her gentle voice will guide you through a soothing meditation, setting the tone for a story of inspiration and connection. Then we'll make our way to Havenport's quaint library, where a special quilt exhibit awaits. Each quilt tells its own story, woven with threads of tradition, love, and memory. In the quiet of the library, the soft rustle of pages and the faint scent of aged books create a cocoon of calm. A crackling fire casts its warmth over the room, and the quilts, with their intricate patterns and vibrant colors, seem to glow with life. Through Grace's reflections, we'll explore the power of storytelling through stitches, the way a single quilt can hold a legacy of joy, comfort, and belonging. Here at Cozy Sleep Haven, we celebrate these tender moments, the beauty of creativity, the quiet joy of a shared story, and the peace that comes from feeling connected to something greater. We hope you'll return for more cozy adventures and heartwarming tales from Havenport. For now, let's join Grace on this inspiring journey of stillness, art, and connection. Let's take a moment to settle in, to let the gentle rhythm of the rain carry you into stillness. Close your eyes if you'd like, or let them soften, unfocused. Imagine yourself wrapped in a soft, warm quilt, its weight gentle against your body, its fabric soft and comforting. The rain falls outside, steady and rhythmic, a soothing backdrop to this moment. Picture the quilt around you, its colors rich, its patterns inviting, each square a patch of comfort, stitched just for you. Feel the fabric against your skin, warm and familiar, as though it's holding you in a gentle embrace. Inhale deeply, and notice how the quilt seems to hold that warmth. Exhale slowly, and let the quilt absorb the day's tension, one breath at a time. Beyond the window, the world softens under the rain. Trees sway gently, their leaves catching tiny droplets. Puddles ripple with each delicate tap of water. The rain has a way of quieting everything, of softening the edges of the world. It's as though time itself slows, inviting you to do the same. Take another deep breath, and as you exhale, feel yourself sinking deeper into the quilt, into its warmth, its softness. The quilt wraps around you like a cocoon, protecting you from the outside world, letting you simply be. Notice how the rain outside mirrors the quilt's embrace, each drop soothing, calming, grounding. You are safe here, held by the quilt, comforted by its weight. There is no rush, no worry, no task awaiting you, only this moment of stillness. As the rain continues its gentle melody, allow your breath to find a rhythm, steady and calm. Let yourself sink fully into the comfort of the quilt and the peace of the rain. When you're ready, bring your awareness back to the room around you, the surface beneath you, the air on your skin. Let's carry this feeling with us, wrapped in warmth and guided by the soothing rhythm of the rain. The sound of the rain followed Grace as she approached the library, its rhythm steady and soothing. She folded her umbrella just before stepping inside, the soft creak of the heavy wooden door announcing her arrival. The warm air of the library embraced her, carrying with it the scent of aged paper, cedarwood, and the faintest hint of lavender. Inside, the library felt like a refuge from the gray drizzle outside. Rows of books stretched toward the ceiling, their spines a tapestry of colors and textures. Soft light from antique lamps glowed golden against the dark wood shelves, casting gentle shadows that danced with the flicker of the rain outside the tall windows. "Grace, my dear," a familiar voice called. Mrs. Birdie appeared from behind a table laden with books, her silver bun perfectly pinned, and her ever-present reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. She wore a cozy cardigan over a floral blouse, the colors muted but warm. In her hands was a teapot, steam curling from its spout like a whisper of welcome. "Mrs. Birdie," Grace said, smiling as she approached. "I thought I'd stop by and see what treasures you're working on today." "Come sit," Mrs. Birdie said, gesturing toward a small reading nook near one of the library's grand windows. "The rain makes for perfect tea drinking and story-sharing weather, don't you think?" Grace followed her to the nook, where two comfortable armchairs faced a low table, adorned with a steaming teapot, delicate porcelain cups, and a plate of shortbread cookies. Draped across the armrest of one chair was a quilt-in-progress, a patchwork of fabrics in deep reds, soft blues, and warm creams, each square telling its own quiet story. "You've been busy," Grace said, her eyes falling on the quilt. She reached out to touch a corner, her fingers brushing the soft fabric. "It's beautiful." Mrs. Birdie poured the tea with practiced precision, her movements deliberate and graceful. "This one's a special project," she explained. "The fabric pieces have been donated by the people of Havenport. Each one carries a bit of someone's life, a memory, a story, a piece of history. I've been stitching them together during these rainy afternoons. It's quite meditative, really." Grace settled into her chair, taking the cup of tea Mrs. Birdie handed her. She held it in her hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers as she listened to the rain tapping gently against the window. "That's such a lovely idea," she said, her voice soft. "What made you think of it?" Mrs. Birdie leaned back in her chair, her eyes twinkling. "I've always believed that quilts are more than just blankets. They're stories, pieced together one square at a time. Each stitch connects a memory, a moment, or a person. This one is no different. Would you like to hear about some of the pieces?" Grace nodded, her curiosity piqued. "I'd love to." Mrs. Birdie smiled, setting her cup down on the saucer. "Well then," she said, her tone turning just a bit mischievous. "Let's start with this one. It belonged to a sailor who used to call Havenport home." And with that, the room seemed to grow even cozier, the sound of rain and the warmth of tea, creating the perfect backdrop for stories stitched into fabric. Grace leaned forward slightly in her chair, cradling the warm teacup between her hands as she listened to Mrs. Birdie speak. The older woman lifted a square of deep navy fabric from the quilt, its edges carefully stitched into place. The material was slightly worn, but its color still rich and vibrant. "This," Mrs. Birdie began, her fingers brushing over the fabric, "came from the jacket of a sailor named Benjamin Hart. He lived here in Havenport decades ago. A quiet man, but oh, the stories he could tell if you caught him in the right mood." Grace smiled, imagining the kind of person Benjamin must have been. Did he donate this himself? Mrs. Birdie shook her head gently. No, dear. This piece came to me after his passing. His granddaughter found it among his belongings and thought it might be fitting for the quilt. She said it reminded her of the nights he'd sit by the fire, mending that old jacket while telling her tales of his travels. She paused, letting the story settle in the quiet room, the rain continuing its gentle rhythm against the windows. Benjamin was a navigator. He spent much of his life on the sea, guiding ships safely to port. When he retired, he chose to settle here in Havenport. Said it was the one place that reminded him of the calm after a storm. Grace traced the pattern of her teacup with her thumb, her thoughts drifting. I love that this piece carries a memory of him. It's not just fabric, it's part of his story. Exactly, Mrs. Birdie said, her voice warm with approval. Quilts have always been a way to preserve stories. Long before books were common, people used fabric to mark events and memories. Births, marriages, even the passage of seasons. She set the quilt down gently and reached for her own cup of tea. This quilt is becoming a tapestry of Havenport's history. Each piece carries something unique, a memory, a connection, and when it's finished, it will be a warm, tangible reminder of the people who've called this town home. Grace took a sip of her tea, the chamomile and honey soothing her senses. She glanced at another piece of fabric, a square of pale yellow with tiny floral prints. What about this one? It's so cheerful. Mrs. Birdie chuckled softly. Ah, that's from a little girl's dress. Her name is Lily. She outgrew it, as children do, but her mother saved it because it was her favorite. Lily used to twirl around the town square in that dress, singing at the top of her lungs. When her mother heard about the quilt, she brought it to me, saying it deserved to keep bringing joy. Grace smiled at the thought of a child's laughter filling the square, the fabric holding a piece of that happiness. It's amazing how something so simple can carry so much meaning. Mrs. Birdie nodded thoughtfully. That's the beauty of it, my dear. Quilts are more than the sum of their parts. They're stitched together with love, memory, and care. And in their own way, they keep those memories alive. Grace leaned back in her chair, letting the cozy atmosphere wrap around her. The rain outside continued its steady song, and the library felt like a world unto itself, a place where stories, both spoken and stitched, wove together seamlessly. Mrs. Birdie carefully smoothed the navy patch on the quilt, her fingers tracing the edges of the fabric, as though she could still feel the life it once held. Now, Benjamin's story didn't end when he retired from the sea, she said, her voice soft and rhythmic, matching the gentle patter of the rain outside. He became a bit of a fixture here in Havenport. People would seek him out, not just for his tales of faraway places, but for his wisdom. Grace sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. What kind of wisdom? Well, Mrs. Birdie began, leaning back in her chair. Benjamin had this way of seeing things differently. He'd spent so much time on the open water, navigating storms and calms alike, that he'd developed a knack for reading people the same way he read the stars. He'd tell you exactly what you needed to hear, whether you wanted to hear it or not. Grace smiled. He sounds like someone who'd be full of surprises. Oh, he was, Mrs. Birdie said with a chuckle. And his stories, my, they were something else. He once told me about a journey through the North Atlantic, where the waves were so high they seemed to touch the sky. The crew was terrified, but Benjamin, calm as ever, navigated them through. Said he trusted the stars more than the storm. Grace's gaze lingered on the navy fabric. It's fitting, then, that a piece of his jacket ended up in the quilt. It's like he's still offering comfort, even now. Mrs. Birdie's smile softened. That's exactly how I see it. This piece represents strength and resilience. When someone wraps themselves in this quilt, I hope they'll feel that. A steadying presence, like a sailor guiding them through choppy waters. The sound of the rain seemed to deepen, its rhythm soothing and steady. Grace let her thoughts drift for a moment, imagining Benjamin sitting by the fire, his hands deftly repairing his jacket, the light catching the creases of his weathered face. She could almost hear the creak of the floorboards beneath his boots, the low hum of a sailor's song carrying softly through the room. "Do you know what else I love about this patch?" Mrs. Birdie asked, her voice breaking gently through Grace's thoughts. "It's not perfect. Look closely. You'll see the edges are frayed, and there are tiny holes from years of wear. But those imperfections only make it more beautiful. They tell the story of a life well lived." Grace nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the quilt. It's a reminder that we don't have to be perfect to be meaningful. "Exactly," Mrs. Birdie said, her eyes twinkling. "Quilts and lives are made up of imperfect pieces stitched together. That's what makes them unique. That's what gives them their charm." Grace smiled, the warmth of the library and the steady cadence of Mrs. Birdie's words wrapping around her like the quilt itself. The story of Benjamin and his sailor's patch was more than just history. It was a thread of connection, a piece of Havenport's heart. As the rain continued to fall, Grace felt grateful to be part of this moment, this story, this quilt of memories. Grace's eyes wandered over the quilt until they settled on a cheerful square of pale yellow fabric, speckled with tiny blue and pink flowers. The edges were slightly faded, but the pattern remained bright and lively. A small burst of sunshine among the deeper tones of the other patches. "This one has such a happy feel to it," Grace said, lightly touching the square. "What's the story behind it?" Mrs. Birdie's face lit up, her expression soft and warm. That piece came from a little girl named Lily. She's just 7 years old, full of life and energy. The fabric is from her favorite dress, a dress she wore so often that her mother said it became part of her." Grace chuckled, imagining a lively little girl twirling in the rain-soaked streets of Havenport. It does look like the kind of fabric you'd wear on a sunny day, no matter the weather. "Exactly," Mrs. Birdie said with a fond smile. "Lily's mother brought it to me a few weeks ago, saying, 'This dress has too many memories to be packed away in a box.' She wanted it to live on in this quilt, to keep sharing its joy. And when I look at it, I can almost hear Lily's laughter echoing through the town square." Grace leaned back in her chair, her gaze softening as she imagined the scene. "Tell me more about Lily," she said, her voice filled with quiet curiosity. "Well," Mrs. Birdie began, folding her hands in her lap, "Lily is the kind of child who notices everything. She'll point out the shapes in the clouds, the sparkle of raindrops on a spider's web, or the way the wind carries the smell of the sea. She's curious about the world, always asking questions, always exploring. And that dress, it was her uniform for all her adventures." Grace smiled, the image of Lily vivid in her mind. It's amazing how something as simple as a piece of fabric can hold so much life. Mrs. Birdie nodded. That's the magic of quilts, my dear. They take these moments, these fleeting pieces of happiness, and preserve them. When Lily grows up and sees this quilt, she might not remember every detail of her adventures, but she'll feel them. That's the power of memory, stitched into fabric. Grace traced the edge of the square with her fingertip, marveling at its softness. It must feel wonderful to be part of something so meaningful. Mrs. Birdie smiled, her gaze settling on the quilt. It does. Every stitch is a connection to the people and moments that make Havenport what it is. And Lily's piece, it's a reminder of the joy and curiosity we should all carry with us, no matter our age. The sound of the rain seemed to soften, as though listening to their conversation. Grace let herself sink deeper into the chair, the warmth of the library, and the steady rhythm of Mrs. Birdie's words filling her with a sense of calm. This was more than just a quilt. It was a celebration of life, stitched together one memory at a time. Grace's eyes moved to another piece of the quilt, this one unlike the others. It was a delicate square of cream-colored fabric with an intricate lace pattern that seemed almost too fine to touch. The edges were slightly worn, but the detail remained exquisite, as if it had been lovingly cared for over the years. This one feels different, Grace said, leaning forward for a closer look. It's beautiful. Mrs. Birdie nodded, her smile touched with reverence. Ah, yes, that piece has a long history. It came from an old heirloom tablecloth, one that belonged to the Leighton family. The fabric has seen countless gatherings, from Christmas dinners to summer picnics. It holds the echoes of laughter and the warmth of family moments. Grace smiled softly. You can almost feel it, can't you? The history in the fabric. Mrs. Birdie's eyes twinkled as she began her story. The Leightons were one of the first families to settle in Havenport. Their matriarch, Eleanor Leighton, was a remarkable woman. She had this tablecloth made shortly after her wedding, as a way to bring beauty and ceremony to the meals she prepared. She believed that every meal, no matter how simple, deserved a touch of elegance. Grace imagined Eleanor laying out the tablecloth with care, smoothing its edges before placing freshly baked bread and steaming bowls of soup atop it. It's lovely to think of how many moments it's been a part of. Mrs. Birdie nodded. Over the years, that tablecloth saw it all. Children's birthdays with sticky fingers, quiet cups of tea shared between old friends, and celebrations where every chair around the table was filled. Even when it became too delicate to use regularly, the family kept it as a treasure, a reminder of all those cherished moments. And now it's part of the quilt, Grace said, her voice tinged with awe. It's like it's still bringing people together, just in a different way. Exactly, Mrs. Birdie said, her hands resting gently on the fabric. When Eleanor's great-granddaughter brought me this piece, she said it was fraying too much to keep whole, but she couldn't bear to let it go entirely. She wanted it to find a new life in the quilt, where it could keep sharing its warmth. Grace reached out and touched the lace square lightly, as if trying to absorb its history. It's amazing to think about all the stories this fabric holds. Meals shared, conversations had, lives lived. Mrs. Birdie smiled, her voice soft. That's the beauty of an heirloom, my dear. It carries the weight of time, but it also carries the love and connection that make time meaningful. The rain outside continued to patter gently against the windows, the sound mingling with the quiet comfort of the library. Grace sat back in her chair, letting her thoughts drift to her own family traditions, the moments that had shaped her life, and how even the smallest things, a tablecloth, a quilt, could hold so much meaning. Each piece of this quilt feels like a gift, Grace said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. A little piece of someone's heart. Mrs. Birdie nodded, her smile warm. That's exactly what it is, Grace. A gift? And when this quilt is finished, it will carry all those hearts stitched together into something whole, something enduring. Grace gazed at the quilt, feeling its quiet power. The lace square seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, a tangible reminder that the past lives on in the stories we choose to tell, and in the stitches that hold them together. Mrs. Birdie placed the quilt back on her lap, her hands lightly smoothing over the fabric as if it were a beloved friend. The rain continued its gentle cadence outside, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the deliberate pace of her words. You know, Grace, she began, quilting has always been about more than just sewing pieces of fabric together. It's about connection, between people, between moments, and even between generations. Grace nodded, leaning forward in her chair. I can see that. Every piece of this quilt has a story, and together they form something even greater. Exactly, Mrs. Birdie said, her smile soft. Each piece is a thread in the tapestry of a community. Think about it. Quilts have been made for centuries, not just for warmth, but for togetherness. Women would gather around a quilting frame, sharing stories as they worked. It was a way to bond, to create something lasting. She paused, her eyes thoughtful. Even during hard times, wars, economic struggles, quilting was a source of comfort. People would use scraps of whatever fabric they could find, turning remnants of the past into something new. Those quilts weren't just practical. They were symbols of resilience and hope. Grace traced the edge of her teacup with her finger, the warmth seeping into her hands. It's incredible to think about how much history is tied up in something so simple. Mrs. Birdie's expression grew wistful. I remember my grandmother's quilt. It was a log cabin pattern, made entirely from leftover fabric from dresses, curtains, even old aprons. As a child, I used to trace the lines of each square, asking her about the stories behind the fabrics. She'd tell me about the dress she wore to her first dance, or the curtains that hung in the house where she raised her children. Grace smiled, picturing the scene. It must have been like holding a piece of her life. It was, Mrs. Birdie said. And when she passed, that quilt became one of my most treasured possessions. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't, but because it held her memories, her love, her life. The room grew quiet for a moment, the rain outside filling the space with its soothing melody. Grace gazed at the quilt on Mrs. Birdie's lap, the patches of fabric seeming to glow under the soft lamplight. Each piece told a story, yes, but together they formed something even more profound, a reminder of how deeply lives are intertwined. It's almost like meditation, Grace said after a moment, her voice soft, stitching everything together, piece by piece, finding the rhythm, the flow, and the meaning in the process. Mrs. Birdie's eyes sparkled as she nodded. That's a beautiful way of putting it, my dear. Quilting is a kind of meditation, a way to focus the mind and center the heart. Every stitch is an act of love, a way of honoring the past while creating something for the future. Grace leaned back, letting those words settle over her. The library felt warmer, cozier, as though the quilt itself radiated its own quiet light. The rain continued its steady song, a background melody for the stories and connections they were weaving together. It was a moment of perfect stillness, where time seemed to slow, and the world outside faded into the soft embrace of memory and meaning. Mrs. Birdie unfolded a section of the quilt where new pieces were waiting to be stitched. The surrounding patches formed a vibrant mosaic, each square unique, but somehow fitting perfectly into the whole. Grace leaned forward, the soft lamplight casting a warm glow over the fabric. "Would you like to add a piece, my dear?" Mrs. Birdie asked, her smile inviting. "It's a simple process, but there's something meaningful about stitching your own memory into the quilt." "I'd love to," Grace said, her voice filled with quiet excitement. She glanced at the basket of fabric scraps beside Mrs. Birdie's chair, her fingers brushing over the assortment of textures and colors. One caught her eye, a deep indigo square with tiny silver dots scattered across it like stars in a night sky. "This one," Grace said, holding it up. "It feels calming." Mrs. Birdie's expression softened. "Ah, that fabric came from an evening gown donated by a woman who loved to dance. She always said that starlit nights held a kind of magic for her. It seems fitting that you choose it. You're weaving your story into hers." Grace smiled, touched by the thought. She carefully positioned the fabric on the quilt, ensuring its edges aligned with the surrounding patches. Mrs. Birdie handed her a needle threaded with fine silver thread, its subtle shimmer catching the light. "Just take it slow," Mrs. Birdie said, her voice soothing. "There's no rush. Quilting is about finding your rhythm, one stitch at a time." As Grace began to sew, the act of stitching felt meditative. The needle dipped in and out of the fabric with a gentle precision, each stitch connecting her to the quilt in a tangible way. She found her thoughts drifting, not just to the fabric story, but to her own memories of starlit nights, quiet walks under the sky, the hum of crickets, the cool air on her skin. "This quilt is like a living memory," Grace said, her voice soft. "It's amazing how something so simple can hold so much meaning." Mrs. Birdie nodded. "That's the magic of quilts, my dear. They remind us that even the smallest scraps, a forgotten dress, a worn scarf, can carry great significance when they're part of something larger. And when you add your own stitches, you become part of its story." Grace tied off the final stitch and smoothed her hand over the fabric, feeling a sense of accomplishment. The indigo square seemed to glow among the surrounding patches, as though it had always belonged. Mrs. Birdie leaned over to inspect the work, her smile widening. "Beautifully done," she said. "This piece will carry your touch, your memory, into the quilt's journey." The rain outside continued its gentle rhythm, a backdrop to the quiet satisfaction of their shared moment. As Grace leaned back in her chair, the quilt resting between them, she felt an unexpected sense of connection, not just to the quilt, but to the people and stories it represented. It was as though her own life had become part of something much greater, one stitch at a time. "Now," Mrs. Birdie said with a twinkle in her eye, "shall I tell you the story of another patch?" Grace nodded eagerly, ready to hear more about the lives woven into the quilt. Mrs. Birdie gently unfolded another section of the quilt, her fingers pausing on a delicate square of ivory lace. The intricate floral design caught the light, its edges softened by time. Grace's gaze lingered on the fabric, its fragile beauty standing out among the sturdier patches surrounding it. "This piece," Mrs. Birdie began, her voice hushed as though she were sharing a secret, "comes from the wedding gown of Eleanor Whitaker. She was a bride here in Havenport many, many years ago." Grace's eyes widened. "A piece of a wedding gown? That's incredible. How did it end up in the quilt?" Mrs. Birdie smiled, her expression tinged with nostalgia. "Eleanor married her sweetheart Charles during a spring ceremony at the little chapel near the cliffs. It was a small wedding, just close family and friends, but it was full of love. They didn't have much, but Charles saved every penny to buy her that gown. The lace was her favorite part, a luxury she never thought she'd own." Grace leaned closer, imagining the scene. "That must have been such a special day." "Oh, it was," Mrs. Birdie said, her voice growing wistful. "They were married for 50 years, raising their family here in Havenport. That lace saw a lifetime of anniversaries, celebrations, and quiet evenings by the fire. When Eleanor passed, her daughter kept the gown as a keepsake. But time took its toll, and the fabric began to fray. Her fingers brushed the lace square with a gentle reverence. The gown couldn't be preserved as it was, but her daughter wanted the lace to live on. She brought it to me, saying, 'This fabric holds so many memories. I want it to keep telling its story.'" Grace smiled softly, the lace seeming even more delicate in its new purpose. "That's such a beautiful way to honor her memory." Mrs. Birdie nodded. "It represents so much more than a wedding day. It's about love, commitment, and the quiet strength it takes to build a life together. This piece is a testament to the bond that Eleanor and Charles shared, a bond that continues to inspire their family to this day." Grace traced the edge of the square with her fingertip, careful not to disturb its delicate pattern. "It's amazing how something so small can hold so much meaning." "That's the beauty of it," Mrs. Birdie said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "Quilts have a way of turning fragments into something whole. This lace, once part of a single gown, now weaves its story into the lives of everyone who sees it." The sound of the rain seemed softer now, as though it too were listening to the story. Grace leaned back in her chair, her heart warmed by the thought of the love and history stitched into the fabric. "Eleanor's lace is one of my favorite pieces," Mrs. Birdie said. "It's a reminder that love endures, even as time changes everything else." Grace smiled, the warmth of the moment settling over her. "I'll think of that every time I see this square." "As you should," Mrs. Birdie said with a twinkle in her eye. "Now, let me show you another piece. This one has a story all its own." She turned the quilt again, revealing a vibrant square of silk that shimmered even in the soft light. Grace's curiosity piqued, ready to hear the next chapter of this remarkable quilt's history. Mrs. Birdie's fingers rested on a vibrant square of fabric, a rich, jewel-toned silk in shades of crimson and gold, its pattern a lively swirl of paisley. The piece seemed to almost dance in the light, its colors bold and full of energy. "This piece," Mrs. Birdie began with a chuckle, "comes from the tie of a traveling salesman named Edward Walsh. He was quite the character, always breezing into Havenport with his sample case and a smile." Grace couldn't help but smile in return. "A tie? I wasn't expecting that. What was Edward like?" Oh, he was larger than life, Mrs. Birdie said, her eyes sparkling with the memory. Edward traveled all across the region, selling everything from fine china to fancy linens. But no matter where he went, he always made a point to stop in Havenport, especially around the holidays. Grace leaned in, intrigued. Why the holidays? Well, Mrs. Birdie said, her tone turning fond. Edward had no family of his own, but he considered Havenport his home away from home. Every December, he'd arrive with a new batch of wares and spend a week here, staying at the inn and joining the town's celebrations. He loved the holiday parades, the caroling, and especially the Christmas feast at the town square. He had a knack for making everyone feel like they were part of his family. Grace traced the edge of the silk square, imagining the vibrant man who once wore it. It sounds like he brought a lot of joy to the town. He did, Mrs. Birdie said with a nod. And that tie of his, it was his signature. No matter the occasion, Edward always wore his brightest, most colorful tie. He said it was a way to stand out, but I think it was more than that. It was his way of spreading cheer, of saying, "Life's too short to wear boring ties." Grace laughed softly. That does sound like someone larger than life. Mrs. Birdie's smile grew wistful. When Edward passed, the innkeeper found his tie tucked neatly in a drawer. She brought it to me, saying it was too lively to be forgotten. And so it found its way into the quilt. Grace's fingers brushed the silk again, its smooth texture a stark contrast to the sturdy cottons and delicate lace surrounding it. It's such a fitting tribute to someone who seemed to live so boldly. It is, Mrs. Birdie agreed. This fabric is more than just a piece of a tie. It's a piece of Edward's legacy. Whenever I look at it, I think of his laughter, his kindness, and the way he brought a spark of life to every room he entered. The rain outside softened, its steady rhythm blending seamlessly with the warmth of the moment. Grace felt a deep sense of connection to Edward, someone she'd never met but could picture so clearly through Mrs. Birdie's words. "This square," Grace said, her voice thoughtful, "reminds me that even the smallest things, a tie, a smile, can leave a lasting impact." Mrs. Birdie nodded. "Indeed, my dear, and that's the magic of this quilt. It holds not just memories, but the essence of the people who've shared their stories with it." She turned the quilt again, revealing a square of sturdy denim, faded but full of character. "And now, let me tell you about this one. It belonged to someone whose hands were always busy creating." Grace leaned forward, eager to hear what came next. Mrs. Birdie gently unfolded another section of the quilt, her fingers resting on a square of faded denim. The fabric was sturdy, its edges slightly frayed, but it carried a warmth that spoke of long hours of devoted use. "This piece," Mrs. Birdie began, "came from the apron of Margaret Hawthorne. She was Havenport's seamstress for over 40 years, and her hands were always busy, sewing, mending, and creating. She was a cornerstone of this community, though she'd never have admitted it." Grace smiled, imagining the kind of person Margaret must have been. "What was she like?" "Oh, Margaret was a quiet soul," Mrs. Birdie said, her tone fond, but her work spoke volumes. She had a knack for bringing worn things back to life, patching up torn trousers, restitching old curtains, and making sure every child in Havenport had a sturdy winter coat. People often said she had magic in her fingers. Grace traced the edge of the denim square, its texture rough but comforting. It sounds like she gave so much to the town. She did, Mrs. Birdie said with a nod. Her little shop, tucked away near the market square, was always a hub of activity. People would come in not just for her skill, but for her kindness. She had this way of listening, really listening, that made you feel seen. And though she didn't have much herself, she never hesitated to give what she could. More than once, she made dresses and suits for people who couldn't afford to pay her, insisting it was just scraps. Grace felt a pang of admiration for this woman she'd never met. She sounds remarkable. She was, Mrs. Birdie said, her smile softening. This piece of denim comes from an apron she wore nearly every day. It bore the marks of her work. Faint stains from thread dye, tiny holes where scissors and pins had rested. It was a testament to her dedication. "How did it end up in the quilt?" Grace asked. Mrs. Birdie's expression grew wistful. When Margaret passed, her daughter came across the apron in a box of her belongings. It was too worn to save, but she couldn't bear to part with it completely. So she cut a piece of it and brought it to me, saying, "This fabric carries my mother's spirit. I wanted to keep creating, even in a small way." Grace ran her fingers over the square again, the faint texture of worn threads beneath her touch. "And now it's part of something larger," she said softly. "Just like Margaret was." Mrs. Birdie nodded. "Exactly. Her story, her kindness, and her work live on in this quilt. It's a reminder of the quiet ways people make the world a better place, one stitch at a time." The rain outside seemed to echo the sentiment. Its steady rhythm, a quiet tribute to the hard-working seamstress who had touched so many lives. Grace leaned back, letting the warmth of the story settle over her like the quilt itself. "Every time I look at this square," Mrs. Birdie said, "I think of how Margaret's hands shaped this town. And now her legacy is stitched into something that will keep bringing comfort and connection." Grace smiled, her gaze drifting to the quilt. "It's incredible how something as simple as a piece of denim can carry so much meaning." Mrs. Birdie reached for the quilt again, her eyes twinkling. "Now, let me show you another square. This one's from a man who brought a different kind of joy to Havenport." Grace leaned forward, her curiosity piqued once more, as Mrs. Birdie turned the quilt to reveal a bold square of red and gold fabric. Mrs. Birdie's hands moved to a striking square of red and gold fabric, its edges slightly worn, but still vibrant. The rich colors seemed to leap out from the quilt, drawing Grace's attention immediately. "This one," Mrs. Birdie began, "comes from the uniform of William Billy Hayes, Havenport's beloved band leader. He was the heart and soul of every holiday parade in this town for years." Grace's eyes lit up. A band leader? That must have been quite the presence. "Oh, Billy was unforgettable," Mrs. Birdie said with a fond laugh. "He wasn't the tallest man, but he had a way of commanding attention with his energy and enthusiasm. Every year, he'd lead the town's marching band down Main Street for the Christmas parade, his baton spinning through the air like it had a life of its own." Grace smiled, picturing the scene. "It sounds like he brought a lot of joy to the community." "He did," Mrs. Birdie said, her expression softening. "Billy had a way of making everyone feel included. He didn't care if you'd never played an instrument before. If you wanted to be in the band, he'd find a place for you. He said it wasn't about perfection. It was about the joy of making music together." Grace's gaze lingered on the fabric, its bold colors evoking the lively energy of a parade. What happened to his uniform? When Billy retired, he kept it tucked away in his closet, Mrs. Birdie explained. He'd pull it out every now and then to show his grandchildren, telling them stories about the parades and the mishaps along the way, like the time the tuba player tripped and sent the whole back row tumbling. Grace laughed, imagining the scene. Sounds like he had a lot of great memories tied to it. Oh, he did, Mrs. Birdie said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. But as he got older, he realized the uniform deserved a new life. He brought it to me himself, saying, "This fabric has seen so many smiles. I think it's time for it to see a few more." Grace reached out to touch the square, her fingers brushing over the gold embroidery. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "and so full of life, just like his story." Mrs. Birdie nodded. "That's why I placed it near the center of the quilt. It's a reminder of how one person's joy can spread to so many others. Billy's uniform represents celebration, togetherness, and the spirit of community." The rain outside continued to fall gently, a soothing counterpoint to the vibrant energy of the story. Grace leaned back in her chair, imagining the sound of the band playing, the laughter of children lining the streets, and the pride in Billy's voice as he led the parade. "It's amazing how much this quilt holds," Grace said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's like a whole town's heart stitched together." Mrs. Birdie smiled, her eyes bright. "That's exactly what it is, my dear. Each piece tells its own story, but together they create something far greater." Grace's gaze lingered on the bold red and gold square, her thoughts full of the lives and moments it represented. She felt a quiet gratitude for the chance to hear these stories and to be part of something so meaningful. "And now," Mrs. Birdie said, folding her hands over the quilt, "I believe it's time we wrap up for today, but not without a proper farewell." Grace nodded, a contented smile on her face, as the rain's steady rhythm accompanied their peaceful conclusion. Mrs. Birdie carefully folded the quilt, her hands moving with the kind of reverence reserved for something truly cherished. The rain outside had softened to a faint drizzle, its gentle rhythm blending seamlessly with the quiet comfort of the library. "Well, Grace," Mrs. Birdie said, setting the quilt aside, "I think that's enough stitching and storytelling for one day. But what a lovely addition your piece makes to this quilt." Grace smiled, her gaze lingering on the folded quilt. "Thank you for letting me be part of it. Hearing these stories has been so comforting, like being wrapped in the memories of Havenport." Mrs. Birdie's eyes twinkled behind her small reading glasses. "That's exactly the purpose of a quilt like this, to remind us of the connections we share, the moments that bring us together, and the memories that make us who we are. It's a tangible reminder of community and care." Grace leaned back in her chair, letting the warmth of Mrs. Birdie's words settle over her. The quiet hum of the library, the soft glow of the lamplight, and the steady tap of rain against the windows created a cocoon of tranquility around them. "I can't thank you enough for today," Grace said softly. "This has been exactly what I needed, a chance to slow down and reflect." Mrs. Birdie reached across the table, patting Grace's hand gently. "You're always welcome here, my dear, and the quilt will be here too, waiting for its next story, its next patch." Grace glanced out the window, watching the rain ripple across the cobblestone streets. The town seemed quieter now, as though it too had been lulled into a peaceful state by the rhythm of the rain and the warmth of the library. "You know," Grace said after a moment, "I think I'll carry this feeling with me. The stories, the connections, the idea that even the smallest things, like a patch of fabric, can hold so much meaning." Mrs. Birdie smiled, her expression one of quiet pride. "That's the magic of quilts, Grace. They teach us that beauty lies in the pieces we stitch together, in the moments we choose to remember." The two sat in companionable silence for a moment, the rain outside providing a soft melody. Finally, Grace stood, gathering her coat and umbrella. She hesitated by the door, turning back to Mrs. Birdie. "Thank you again for the tea, the stories, and the warmth," Grace said. "I'll be back soon to see how the quilt's coming along." Mrs. Birdie waved her off with a warm smile. "I'll look forward to it, dear. Safe travels in the rain, and may the quilt stories stay with you." Grace stepped outside, the cool drizzle meeting her skin as she opened her umbrella. The cobblestones glistened under the street lamps, and the sound of her footsteps mingled with the soft patter of rain. As she made her way home, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, a reminder that even on the rainiest of days, there is warmth to be found in the stories we share. The quilt might stay behind in the library, but its meaning and the comfort of this afternoon were stitched into Grace's heart, a memory she would carry with her long after the rain had stopped. As the rain continues to fall gently outside, let's take a moment to reflect on the warmth of today's story. Quilts are more than just fabric and thread. They're a reminder of how life's pieces, however small or imperfect, come together to create something whole and meaningful. Imagine yourself wrapped in a quilt now, one that holds your own stories, each patch stitched with care, a piece of your journey woven into the fabric. Perhaps one square is a memory of laughter shared with loved ones, another, a quiet moment of peace under a starlit sky, and maybe a patch that reminds you of overcoming a challenge, stitched with resilience and strength. The rain outside creates a soothing rhythm, much like the rhythm of stitching. Steady, deliberate, calming. Just as a quilt is made one stitch at a time, so too are our lives pieced together, moment by moment. And just like those fabric squares, each moment, no matter how small or ordinary, carries its own kind of beauty. Think about the stories we've heard today. The sailor's patch, a symbol of strength and calm. The little girl's dress, carrying the joy of childhood. The heirloom tablecloth, rich with family gatherings. The band leader's uniform, bursting with celebration and community. These stories remind us that even the simplest things can hold immense meaning when shared with others. Now, take a deep breath and let the warmth of those stories settle over you. Feel the softness of your own quilt of memories, wrapping around you like a gentle embrace. Let the weight of the day drift away, as though it's being carried off by the rain. With each breath, allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort. Imagine the steady patter of raindrops weaving through the air like thread, stitching the world into a blanket of peace. The rain has its own quiet magic, washing away tension and leaving only stillness in its wake. As your mind grows quiet, picture a cozy room. Perhaps the library where Grace and Mrs. Birdie shared tea and stories. The quilt is draped over a chair, waiting for its next patch, its next memory. The lamplight casts a soft glow, and the sound of rain against the windows is the only sound. It's a place of peace, of comfort, of belonging. Let that feeling guide you now. Let it carry you into a restful sleep. Your own quilt of memories will be here when you wake, ready to hold you in its warmth and remind you of the beauty stitched into every day.